Shalom, everyone. It's Nathaniel. We're going to continue with our Bible study, and we're going to continue with our theme for our Bible study, which is repair the breach, rise up, and build. So as we begin the study, we always want to begin with our guiding scriptures, 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15, which tells us to study to show ourselves approved unto the Most High, workmen who need not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. And also 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16, that gives us the encouragement that all scripture is God-breathed and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man or the woman of the Most High may be complete, thoroughly furnished unto every good work. So as we enter into our study for this session, we're going to move with the understanding that we are still in the process of repairing the walls and rising to rebuild. So the last few weeks, we've been in the book of Ezra. And as we mentioned at the outset of this particular year-long focus and this year-long study, we're looking at the instructions that were given to Ezra and Nehemiah, as both of those individuals had a longing to return back to Jerusalem after their nation had been scattered and was in captivity in Babylon for 70 years. And these particular chapters, these particular books are actually an account of what happened when the people at the end of those 70 years were allowed to go back into the land. The reason we're looking at these particular books is because we are being given that same unction for 2022, which is to repair the breach and rise up and build. So we're looking at Ezra and Nehemiah as the examples from the Tanakh as to what that looked like with the children of Israel at that particular point in time, coming out of captivity in Babylon and from Babylon. And we're also making the correlation between what they were dealing with and what we, as the Most High's people, are dealing with today and in these days. So that's the context in which we will continue our study. The last couple of weeks, we have been looking at that from the book of Ezra's perspective, and now we're going to move into the book of Nehemiah. And as we had said several times, actually, let me stop that now. Okay, so as we have said several times, the correlation between what the children of Judah, the people who lived in and around Jerusalem who had been scattered, and their offspring who had been living in Babylon, what they went through is instructive for us as the Most High's people. And so as we look at Nehemiah, we're going to continue to examine those things. And so the way that we're going to examine them, and let me go ahead and before we pull up the scriptures, I want to show the context again. So we've shown this slide several times before, but this sort of gives the timeline as well as the names under which the study is being viewed. So again, the overall topic for this entire year is repair the breach, rise up and build. And what we're looking at is the building and reestablishing of the temple and Jerusalem, and how that came in the three stages. So so far in the study, we've looked at starting at around 536 BC, the reestablishing of the altar in the temple. And that was when Cyrus, the king of Persia, defeated the Babylonian kingdom and allowed the children of Israel, specifically the tribe of Judah, or the Yehudim, to begin to return to the land. King Cyrus was actually prompted to do this through a vision that he had from the Most High. And so when the Most High gave him that vision, the vision was that you need to let the Jews go back into their land. And that then prompted the king of Persia, Cyrus, the king of Persia, to look for who should do that. And so several names came up. Zerubbabel, who was the grandson of King Jehoiakim of Judah, he then was a part of those people that went back into the land. And this was somewhere around 539 or so. He went back into the land, given that permission by King Cyrus, and King Cyrus also allowed him to take a number of other people from Judea that had been living as captives in Babylon to return with him. And so that's where Zerubbabel comes in, and that's found in the book of Ezra, which is what we had been studying. So we looked at Ezra chapter 1 all the way to the end of the book, and we're able to see how that played itself out. So as we mentioned, the first thing that they did was, when they went back into the land, was to rebuild the altar, because everything starts with the sacrifice for sin. And so once the altar is rebuilt, then they begin to work on the temple, the foundation of the temple. And as we have said on several occasions, the heart and soul and really reason for being when it came to the nation of Israel was the temple itself. The temple was a physical structure that started out to be a tabernacle, and inside of the tabernacle was the Ark of the Covenant, and inside the Ark of the Covenant was the word of the Most High. So Israel was established by the Most High. He put his word in the midst of Israel and in the most holy place in Israel, which was in the tabernacle, which again then turned into the temple. And it was that temple that was destroyed because of Israel's rebellion against the Most High and disobedience. So that's why they were in captivity in Babylon. So as they came out of captivity, the first thing that happened was that they were to reestablish the purpose for the nation, which was to be a holy nation that would offer up sacrifices to the Most High, and so that they would be able to be a light to the Gentiles around them. So that's the backdrop that this almost 50,000 people were under when they went back into the land. Now, when Ezra comes along in 457 BC, he begins to restore the temple services. And as he's doing that, things begin to happen. But that which drove Ezra to do what he did was the same thing. It was understanding who the Most High is, what his purpose for the nation is, and how the nation had failed in that purpose. So he's moving in repentance. So the very first thing that he does is he does a confession that his nation and him were not living right. Ezra, by the way, was a priest, and the leadership of the nation was the priestly tribe, the tribe of Levi. And from the tribe of Levi, there was a group of people who were to be the priest of the nation and to offer up not only sacrifices, but to take care of the temple complex. And so that's what Ezra began to do. And then in 445 BC, Nehemiah comes along, basically prompted in the same way that Ezra was prompted by the degradation that his people had fallen into. He goes back into the land and spies out the land to see what is going on, with the permission of Artaxerxes, who was the king again of Persia. And as he goes back, he sees a need to rebuild the wall around the temple, because as Ezra is doing what he's doing, some years earlier, the people are still underneath the the oppressive environment, and being oppressed by the environment of those around them. So there has to be a wall of protection. And so that's what Nehemiah then goes back to do. And then once that wall of protection goes up, which is what we're going to be looking at, then the nation can begin to function with the Most High's word as the center of the nation. So that's what we're going to be looking at. We'll come back to the slides in a second, but before we do that, I want to go ahead and go to the scriptures so that we can start the lesson. And again, we're in Nehemiah. Now, we're not going to go line by line per se, but what we are going to do is look at what is happening in Nehemiah as it relates to what we have studied up to this point in time from Ezra. So again, this is about 15 or so years after Ezra is already back in the land. Okay, and it says, so it starts out in Nehemiah chapter 1, actually, before we go through Nehemiah chapter 1. Ezra ends with Ezra chapter 12, when this prayer of confession is made at the end of all of the things that Ezra has helped the people to do. And it's a confession of sin. This is important because they started out confessing their sins. They began doing the work. And now that they have completed the work, even in doing the work, their people still found a way to be outside of the will of the Most High. So they had to be reintroduced, even while they were in the process of rebuilding, as to what the Most High's will for them was. And so Ezra ends up, the book of Ezra ends up with Ezra leading the people in this confession of sin. Well, what was the sin? The sin basically had to do with worshiping other gods. But the way that played itself out is that they were allowing their young men and their women to intermarry with the people who were around them. And the Most High told them not to do that, because when you do that, your gods are going to be the gods of the people around you rather than vice versa. And so that's what they had to repent of, to the point where they literally had to put away their wives and the children that they had by their wives, especially the children, the priests from the tribe of Levi, but also some of the people in Judah had to do the same thing. So that's where Ezra ends up, and now we're in Nehemiah. So what's the first thing that happens with Nehemiah? I'll read a couple of the verses. In the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, arrived with men from Judah. So see, there were already people in the land of Israel that had come back into the Babylon, where Nehemiah was. And one of those people was his brother. Okay, so he questions his brother, says, so I questioned them about the remnant of the Jews who had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. I'm just going to mention here that even when the children of Israel were in captivity, there were always a group of people in and around Jerusalem who actually had not been taken away captives. For the most part, and this is how the idea of war prisoners of war operated. Usually, when a nation overcame another nation and they took prisoners of war, they would take the cream of the crop of the nation, and it would be that group of people that went back with them and then became their servants. Okay, so usually the so-called cream of the crop were the rich people. Okay, or the people who were in positions of leadership. And that's how it was. If you remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when Nebuchadnezzar overran Jerusalem, that's the kind of person that was taken. He took the best that the nation had and sent them into captivity. All the rest of the people pretty much were left there to fend for themselves, but they were in a broken state, because they had no leadership. Does this sound familiar? Okay. They were in a broken state because all of their leaders had either been killed or were taken into captivity. So it's that group then that we understand. When I say that group, the group of people who were not the cream of the crop were still in Jerusalem. Some of them were. But then you had this other group of people who had been given permission through Cyrus to go back into the land and rebuild the altar and the temple. Okay, so that this is what Nehemiah's brother is telling him. In verse 3 it says, and they told me the remnant who survived the exile are there in the province in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates are burned with fire. We talked about this at the outset of this series of lessons. The wall around Jerusalem could be considered to be a hedge, okay? And as we said at the outset, it was the hedge that protected the vineyard and that which is inside of the vineyard in a physical sense. But in a spiritual sense, the hedge of protection is the leadership of the nation. And so in order for that which is inside, which is animated by the word of the Most High in the people, there has to be a hedge of protection or a wall of protection around the people to separate the people on the inside from the enemies on the outside. So as we said at the outset of the study, the wall or the hedge is supposed to be, and still is supposed to be, those who are in leadership positions in the nation. They're the ones that are supposed to be protecting the people inside of the nation. Okay, so he says in verse 4, and when I heard these words, I sat down and wept. I mourned for days, fasting and praying before the God of heaven. That's the exact same thing that Ezra did. And I would submit to you that those who are searching for the center of the will of the Most High in 2022 are doing the same thing. We are sitting down, we are weeping, we are mourning for the state of our community. Okay. And so it's during those times of mourning that then what ends up happening is we confess. And then in verse 5, it says, then I said, O Yahuwah, Elohim of heaven, the great and awesome Elohim who keeps his covenant of loving devotion with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your eyes be open and your ears attentive to the prayer that I, your servant, now pray before you day and night for your servants, the Israelites. That's what leaders do. They pray for the people. Okay, and they pray to the Most High for the people. They don't pray to the enemies for the people. They pray to the Most High. And in the prayer includes, as it says, I confess the sins that we Israelites have committed against you. Both I and my father's house have sinned. We have behaved corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, statutes, and ordinances that you gave your servant Moses. So that's the nature of a repentant prayer. That's what he's doing, is he is confessing his sins, first of all, and then the sins of the nation. And it's like the same prayer that Isaiah prayed. Woe is me, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. So that's the kind of prayer that the Most High responds to. Okay. And so he says in his prayer, remember, I pray, the word that you commanded your servant Moses, when you said, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. Brothers and sisters, that's exactly what's happened to us. We have been scattered among the nations. We are now living in the land of our captivity. Just as scriptures said then, it's the same thing going on now. Now, we may not be talking about a geographical, well, we can have a discussion whether this is a geographical issue or not, but definitely it's a spiritual issue. We have been scattered. We're right back to Ezekiel chapter 37. We have been scattered, and our bones are everywhere. Okay. So that's how did we get that way? Same way they got that way in Ezekiel, same way that they got that way when we're looking at the prayer that he's praying from what they did before. Okay. So, but if you return to me and keep practice, verse 9, my commandments, then even if your exiles have been banished to the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. That was a physical place when this prayer was prayed. Now we're in a spiritual situation, but the same thing is going on as we speak. And that's why we're looking at this lesson. Okay. They are your servants and your people. So this is something that leadership has a hard time accepting. If you are in a position of leadership, and now I'm speaking specifically to whether you're a pastor, whether you're a teacher, whether you're an apostle, whether you're an evangelist, anybody who's in a position of leadership, or whether you're a community leader or leading a social organization, if you're in a position of leadership, okay, then you have to understand that the people that you are in charge of leading, you are actually serving those people. You are, first of all, serving the Most High by serving those people. You are not their Lord. You are not their daddy. You are a servant that the Most High has placed in that position. And if you're not walking that way, we're living in a time now where you are going to be moved out of the way, because the Most High is now putting his people back where they're supposed to be. So it says in verse 10, they are your servants and your people. You redeemed them by your great power and mighty hand. O Master, may your ear be attentive to my prayer and to the prayers of your servants who delight to revere your name or revere your name. Give your servant success this day, I pray, and give your servant success this day and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. Okay, so that was Nehemiah's prayer. And from that prayer, Nehemiah gets sent back into the land of Israel to do what? Well, he gets sent back, and the first thing he does is he spies out the land, and he realizes the vulnerability of the people living in the land. Excuse me. So we're going to be covering, we're not going, like I said, we're not going to read line by line, But in Nehemiah chapter 2, starting at, I'm sorry, where is it? Okay, yeah. Starting at verse 11, he goes back to Jerusalem and looks at the walls. Okay, remember that's what we were talking about. So when he inspects the walls, he realizes in the disrepair that those walls are in. So now, and so that happens, and then in chapter 3, he begins to build the walls, okay, with the help of other people. And then when we get to chapter 4, those who were surrounding them, and they've been watching and doing this all along. But chapter 4 brings out the fact that there are always enemies to the work of the Most High and to his people. When the Most High's people are doing what we are supposed to be doing, we got people trying to kill us. That will not change until Jesus comes. As a matter of fact, if you remember when we did our Revelation study, especially in Revelation chapter, the chapter that had the two witnesses, one of the things that happens is the entity that comes out of the abyss attacks the two witnesses and overcomes them. The enemies of the Most High sometimes do win battles, okay, over the Most High's people. We have to understand that. We're not going to win all the battles. But what we're charged to do is the same thing that Nehemiah was charged to do and Ezra was charged to do. You go back and do what I told you to do. So, yeah, you're going to have enemies, but and sometimes those enemies are outside. Most of the time they're outside, but sometimes they're inside too. So that's Nehemiah chapters 1 through 4 in terms of the scriptures themselves. So prayer leads them into the situation, and prayer sustains them while they're in the situation. So there's this prayer that is prayed in Nehemiah chapter 4, starting at verse 9. So it says, so we prayed to our God and posted a guard against them. Who's the them? It's the enemy, day and night. Okay. And so we may come back and actually revisit that prayer, but I wanted to do one other thing before we do that. And so we're going to go now back to the slides. Okay, so we talked about, okay, here's the timeline again. Zerubbabel 536 BC begins to reestablish the altar in the temple. 80 years later, Ezra comes along, 457 BC, begins working on the temple services. So not only is the temple built now, but that which is going on in the temple is reestablished, and that's what the word of the Most High is. And that's, so there's a lot going on there. And then the Nehemiah in 445 BC comes along to rebuild the wall, protecting the city and the temple. So we're going to continue from that. So this is what they came back to. Okay, so when Nehemiah, let me do this. Okay, so when Nehemiah comes back, first of all, he's coming from up in here. This is all in the land of Canaan. This is in the city of Jerusalem, right? So up here is where they were in exile. So he gets to come back from here. And the first thing he does, this is where the altar is. This is where the temple is. All these things have been rebuilt. Both these things have been rebuilt. There are people living in here as well as, and there are people living out here. But what's not in place is this wall that surrounds the temple complex. So when he comes back, the first thing he does is he begins to inspect. And I believe he starts down here at the dung gate. Now, just so that you know, all together in this map, there are 12 gates. Do you remember Revelation at the end of Revelation, it talks about when the New Jerusalem comes down out of heaven, there are 12 gates to the city of Jerusalem, and each one of those gates has the name of one of the tribes, if you remember that. Okay. But here, the gates have different names. So there's the dung gate, there's the water gate, there's the horse gate, the east gate. And by the way, the east gate was always closed. The mikpah gate, the sheep gate, the fish gate. This one is called the old gate. And then Ephraim, there's a gate named after Ephraim. Then there's the corner gate, and then finally the valley gate. So each one of those gates were places in a wall that people could come through, except nobody ever came through the east gate. And we can talk about that later. All right. But when he came back, all of this was in disarray and rubble. Okay. Which means that it was vulnerable to the enemy that was without. All right. By the way, the king's house is right here too. Okay. And hearkening back to Ezekiel, where Ezekiel is told, "Son of man, I have set you as a watchman on the tower." Okay. All along the gate, there were also places where there were watchtowers. Okay. So that people could tell when the enemy was coming. And as you can see, there were no towers here because evidently you couldn't get to destroy the city from this direction. You had to come from this direction. And all of the people who did conquer Jerusalem did come from this direction. So there were more watchtowers here. Okay. So this is what it looked like. Okay. And so again, Jerusalem in the time of Nehemiah, 445 BC. Nehemiah was a governor of Judah. And again, that was under Artaxerxes. If you remember, Artaxerxes is not a man's name. It is a king, the title of king. So you could say under the king of Persia. And so he's responsible for rebuilding Jerusalem during the Second Temple period. All right. So, but you can't rebuild Jerusalem if you don't have any walls. So that's what he did first. Okay. So just to sort of encapsulate what we've talked about, in Nehemiah chapter 1, the first thing that happens, as it was in Ezra, he prays a prayer of repentance for that which caused the state of Judah and Jerusalem to be what it was in the first place. That state was a state of destruction and disrepair and confusion, all of that. Okay. So that's what it says in chapter 1. In chapter 2, Nehemiah gets the permission from Artaxerxes to return to Jerusalem, and he begins to do that. Also in that chapter, he got papers from the king giving him safe passage, because don't forget, in the entire region well, I'm saying don't forget, but we did cover the fact that the Persian Empire was actually the largest empire in that region for many years, for hundreds of years. Okay. So they controlled a lot of territory, but Nehemiah was concerned that once he left Babylon, he could be attacked by those who were the vassal states of the Persian Empire. So he actually needed papers from the king of Persia giving him safe passage. And it says from the governors west of the Euphrates. Okay. Or yeah. So anybody who lived west of the Euphrates, which is where he was going, and then going down south, he would be protected. And that's what happened. So then once he gets there, he inspects the walls. And as he inspects the walls, that's when he cries out to the Most High again. Um, Forgive us for being so disobedient, and now look at what's happened. So we need to start repairing these walls, okay? And that's what begins to happen. So then, the reinstitution of the wall for the remnant. This is just one other way of looking at it. So again, in chapter 1, the same process for rebuilding the altar and the temple. There's a confession of sin, there's repentance, and then there's this desire to rebuild. Now, the desire to rebuild is the same concept that we call Sankofa. In other words, go back and fetch it. What is it that we are going back to fetch? In Sankofa, it's the culture that created us as a people, or the culture under which we as a people came into being. Well, what was the culture that brought us as a people into being? It was the culture established on Mount Sinai. It was the covenant that was given to the people, but it was a covenant that was to remind them, the people, that the Most High was already in covenant with our ancestor Abraham. And part of that covenant had to do with land. See, in order for you to do on the earth what the Most High has for you to do, you have to do it from a place that you are living. And you have to have the control over the place where you are living. Which is why I keep saying we live in the land of our captivity. I'm not sure if everybody is aware, even if you are a person who would be classified as a homeowner, none of the land that you live on, none of the land that you claim to own is actually yours. And if you don't believe me, don't pay your taxes, and you'll see how quickly that land becomes somebody else's land. So your land, and that's why they call it mortgages, mortgage, because mortgage comes from a root word more, which is death. Okay, so basically, when we have a mortgage, there is an end to that. So, and if we don't fulfill the contract that the mortgage is written under, it will be taken from us. So it doesn't really belong to us. So in the very best sense of the word, now this doesn't apply, by the way, to everybody. This applies to people who have been given the understanding that you can have property here, when in actuality, the overwhelming majority of the property in this place called the United States of America is owned by a handful of people and controlled by a handful of people. So they operate under different rules, but that's a whole nother thing. But the reason I'm bringing it up is because the children of Israel had land, but the land that they had was given to them by the Most High. And just like the Most High gave it to them, that land could be taken away if the children of Israel did not do what they were supposed to do in that land. Okay. And what they were supposed to do is follow his instructions, which are in the Tanakh. All right. So when they go back into the land, in order for them to be able to stay in the land, they got to do what the covenant says. And that's where the desire to rebuild comes in. So the very first thing is you got to rebuild a place where the covenant is being kept. All right. So that's the whole thing about this, all that happened in chapter 1 of Nehemiah. When we get to chapter 3 in Nehemiah, they begin also to repair the gates, or again, like we've been saying, in a physical sense, those were literal gates. And the way that they had to repair them, by the way, we've already gone through each one of those names of the gates. And as we said, that those are 12. They're 12 altogether, okay? Now, the interesting thing, though, is that the people who led the rebuilding process were the priests. In the Most High's kingdom, There is no separation of church and state. As a matter of fact, in the Most High's kingdom, there is no such thing as a religious function that is separate and apart from all the other functions in the society. And I'm going to use the word religion only in a very, very loose sense, because the Most High is not about religion at all. Okay. But the Most High says, okay, if you're going to be religious, what that means is that everything is centered around the religion. So everything that you do is energized by, is a list of expectations are given from what is called the religion. But actually what it is the word of the Most High. Everything operates in the Most High's kingdom from his word. So that's why he's the king. See, in a kingdom, you don't have people choosing which laws they're going to make and which laws they're going to ignore. In a kingdom, the king makes a decree. And once the decree is made, the people say, yes, sir. Or if it's a queen, yes, ma'am. And then they have to follow whatever that decree is. That's how the kingdom works. And that's what we live under, because Yeshua came to establish his kingdom on the earth. So we are to do the same thing. Yes, sir, once we know what the words of the king are to us. So as we rebuild, we're not rebuilding based on, okay, so what do I think a good kingdom should be? Or can we come into an agreement as individuals in the kingdom as to rules and regulations that we're going to follow? God's kingdom doesn't work like that. God's kingdom says, here's my will, now carry it out. So our job is to surrender to the will. All right. And so that's in the will of the Most High. It was the will of the Most High that said, you have to protect that which I have placed in that land. I placed my word there. I placed the temple there. I placed the altar that feeds into the temple. I placed the people and where they're going to live in that area. And then I place a wall around them to protect them from people who don't want them there, because they think that the land is theirs. So that's what the Most High did. So the job of Ezra and Nehemiah was to say, yes, sir, we'll put it back. Okay, that's Sankofa in a biblical sense. That which we are going back to fetch has already been given to us, just like it's already been given to us in 2022. We just have to do what the word says, okay? And that's the context that I'm saying now. It's the priest who lead the rebuilding. What is the priest? The priest is the one who is standing between an unholy nation and a holy God, offering up sacrifices that are acceptable to the Most High, and therefore, having cleansed him or herself, begin the function of rebuilding what the Most High has already said. You always start with the spiritual first. It's the spiritual that leads you to do the physical. That's why we're missing it with rebuilding the community as it exists right now. We're trying to address symptoms rather than the problem. The problem is we walked away from the Most High. The solution is walk back into him and he will instruct us. So as the Apostle Paul said, we have to be reconciled with the Most High first. This whole notion about racial reconciliation is a farce. It can't happen, because we don't need to be reconciled with our enemies. We need to be reconciled with the Most High. When we're reconciled with the Most High, that will bring us in reconciliation with one another. And then we can stop our enemies from killing us. But we're trying to do the latter before we do the former. All right. So chapter 4 talks about how the enemies, while the building is going on, and that's why the next lesson we will read some of those scriptures so that we can see exactly what was going on. But the whole process is a process, and it's under attack from the beginning all the way to the end. Our enemy's not going anywhere. Our problem is we keep forgetting that they're our enemies. Anybody who is against the will of the Most High is an enemy of the Most High's people, whether that be someone in the camp or someone out of the camp. Okay, so while we're building, the enemies are trying to figure out how to stop the building. We can't focus on them. We have to focus on what he's given us to do. So the first thing that they're told to, well, no, this is the last thing that they're told to do, is rebuild that wall and rebuild the gates in the wall so that that which is inside the wall can be protected. Okay, so the people had to be encouraged during this time, and they had to be encouraged to continue to work even under stressful circumstances. So that's what we wanted to cover for this session. And Father willing, during the next session, we will look in more detail into Nehemiah chapters 1 through 4, reading more scriptures, and then probably going on further into Nehemiah. The Father bless you and keep you. The Father make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Father lift up his countenance upon you and give